We're excited to present Choosing the Right Fuel, Grants, Debt or Equity, co-hosted by the Other Innovation Mission. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel to the stage. Arindom Datta, Senior Advisor, Sustainability and Technology for many institutions and funds. Dr. Gayathri Swahar, Senior Director, the Nudge Institute. Subhadeep Sanyal, India Lead Wavemaker Impact. And our moderator for today, Kanishka Chatterjee, Managing Director, the Delta Prize. Kanishka, over to you.
Thank you. You saved me the difficult job of introducing the panelists. This is also not very panel friendly. It's almost like a classroom that we have to basically take. Thank you everybody for basically finishing off your lunch and coming to see us and hear us and kind of possibly also ask some questions at the end of this. This panel is very special because over the last 3 years, I have personally learned on my journey in the sector and working in agri and working in social entrepreneurship. I have personally learned a lot from Arindom, from Subhadeep and from Gayathri. So it's beautiful to basically have this opportunity to talk. Akanksha couldn't have been here today because I think she felt slightly ill, but that's also another organization I've really enjoyed interacting with. So let's get started from the conversation perspective. I think it doesn't say here about what this right fuel is for, but the right fuel is for social entrepreneurs. And before we got into this panel, we wanted to basically define social entrepreneurship, and then everybody who's sitting on my right, I'm dyslexic. So said let's not get into that conversation. It's going to be too long. So I think the summary point of social entrepreneurship is that fundamentally there are enterprises in India that are solving difficult problems, and all enterprises solve problems. But intentionality to kind of keep the social cost of doing business, and also fundamentally trying to see where business and social contexts meet, and keeping that at the center, or maybe even basically slightly left of center, right of center, but effectively close to your objectives, is the kind of organizations we are talking about. And though there is, as in the last, I think 10 years, last decade for social entrepreneurship has been beautiful from an India perspective. I think it's not been easy, but the density of social entrepreneurs in India have grown, and the quality of social entrepreneurship has basically evolved quite a lot. But one of the things that still is kind of not really solved or not really very clear, and there are many myths and there are many hurdles in this path, is funding. And when we think about capital and funding, there are 3 broad pathways in front of us: grants, equity, and debt. So the conversation today is to basically kind of nudge out some insights which are relevant for social entrepreneurs, but also relevant for capital partners to think about what they are looking for. So my first question to all 3 of you, and I'll start with Gayathri maybe, and then come to you, Subhadeep, is that what does a social entrepreneur look to you when we're thinking about grants? And for maybe Arindam can talk about all 3 instruments, but I'm going to basically ask him to talk about debt a little bit more. And Subhadeep, from an equity perspective, what's your ideal social entrepreneur? What does that person look like?
So thanks, Kanishka, for having us. For us, social entrepreneur is, you've taken the intention part of it. The most important is somebody who has this whole urge to solve for social issues, but a restlessness for solving at scale, because like it's always said that you can't design small mice and then put them together to make an elephant. So we will always want to look for somebody who can think and design for scale, and who also has the restlessness of making it happen, have the wherewithals and the speed part of it. So that will make an ideal entrepreneur for us from a grant perspective to say what is that experimentation that very boldly somebody is ready to take, and they have the capability and the smarts to kind of carry it through.
Thanks, Kanishka. Gayathri has already defined, social entrepreneurship and the role of grant. And I'll just explain a little bit better. 15, 20 years back, if you looked at grants, debt, and equity, they were very, very distinct instruments, and they were distinct institutions who were providing these three kind of financial facility. Things have got a lot more blurred today. I'll come to that later. But when we talk of grants, it mostly comes from philanthropic capital or from government sources. It's very important to understand. And who are the grantees? Who are the people who are generally accepting grants, or who are deemed to be acceptable from a grant maker's perspective? It's, as Gayathri mentioned, somebody who has taken up a cause to solve a problem, and herein lies the difficulty. Now, does that solving of a problem mean that there is a commercial solution? If there is a commercial solution, then the grant comes in at a very early stage, provided it is something very innovative or it's never been tried earlier. Otherwise, a grant maker will be extremely apprehensive of providing grant to a social enterprise who's solving a social problem if there is a immediate commercial model there, or there's a precedent of people making money out of that. So it's very important that it needs to be extremely innovative. It's something which has not been done, or there is no commercial returns to the work that that person does. Or it's a certain kind of entity, a not-for-profit, which cannot accept the other forms of capital. Now, when we move to debt, it's a short-term facility or a long-term facility for asset building, or a working capital loan which is short-term given to any business. It's important to understand a debt is generally provided to a profitable business for their business requirements, and that money needs to be returned with interest, which needs to be serviced at regular intervals. And because of that, it's important to have visibility and unpredictable cash inflows to make the entity pay back to the financial institution. There are hues of financial institution without getting into details. And equity comes in for businesses where there is a long gestation period. I'm sure Subhadeep will talk a lot more about that. Is where you require capital to build up the capabilities to be able to invest, whether it's technology or in other things, where you have a visibility that you are going to solve a problem, it's going to be commercially viable, but the cash flows and profitability will come at a much later stage of your business. And an equity investor or a venture capital investor, again, there are many different kind of equity providers. They look at and necessarily look at for that the businesses are going to scale up, and that's where they make the money, lump sum money at a certain future point of view. Having said that, I'll just make one more statement before I stop. Now things have got more blurred because of a term which we hear very often in the social media or otherwise, of what's termed blended finance, where you have blending of debt and grant, where the objectives are both commercial impact or climate, and it gets real fuzzy because two different kind of capitals are merged to provide a facility to a business. So now the mingling of grant and debt has started happening with multiple blended finance facilities globally and in India. And of course, even debt and equity have kind of got merged with some special kind of facilities where debts have some clauses which can enable them to convert into equity at some future point. So things have got a lot more blurred today, but these are specific instruments used for specific end use and specific kind of businesses.
So I think not really much to add. I think the point of equity is, the best way to think of it is, if your business needs to still prove out a thesis, you still need to validate whether this value will be delivered to a customer or not, or you need to spend time and effort and hence capital to educate a certain part of the stakeholders. I think that is where, apart from of course core R&D, that is where equity capital is generally more and more required. It's the right thing, but the equity capital definitely comes with the expectation of a much faster ramp up than debt, and grant of course is very different. So I think that is a caveat which, if you're a founder, if you're a business, is to understand that it is the most expensive form of capital available. So if you are building your own business, your equity has to be of certain value, right? So when you think of raising capital, think of it as the most expensive form of capital you'll raise, and it will be something where it is high risk, of course. So it has a high risk appetite. It is okay if the business fails, but it's not okay if it turns into like a slow growing, very small scale business, to the point which Gayathri also made, that there needs to be an element of scale which comes after a certain point in time. I think equity rewards businesses like that, or attracts businesses like that.
Which are faster, and it's basically path of return.
There is a certain escape velocity it will reach at certain point where, so a very simple way to think about it is that every incremental rupee or dollar that you put in should work more or return more than the previous rupee, right? So if your business is of that nature,
Yeah.
if it can't be a linear, like you put 1 rupee, you get 1 rupee, that is not an equity friendly business.
And can I just add one thing to what Subhadeep said? Equity is risk capital, as he mentioned. So an equity provider can happily lose a few of their investments. It doesn't matter. It's factored into the business because they will make a lot of money on a few of their investment. But when any social entrepreneur, any business is engaging with a bank for debt, a bank expects every loan to come back.
Yeah.
Ab initio, when they do their feasibility, their underwriting and all of that, the expectation is 100% of the loans are going to come back. And that's why there's a lot of frustration dealing with banks, because they can reject a lot of good cases also.
So, yeah, very interesting points. I think it just says here, mission meets market. So we've talked about the instruments in a slightly broader way, but when we kind of infuse this overall conversation with impact organizations, impact investing, impact-led debt funds that are basically kind of getting created, like grants are fundamentally very impact-driven. How are you defining, what's that North Star for your capital instrument today when you connect it with impact? Because one of the things that I'm basically kind of hearing in many conversations, and I'm no expert in the capital space, is that we end up saying a lot of things that needs to happen from an impact perspective, but the differential in the expectations of return for an impact-led organizations and a regular on the street D2C brand, it's not kind of different. There's no differentiation that's coming in. So is that your observation as well, or how would you basically kind of define the North Star of impact in the instrument? Maybe debt.
Well,
I don't know.
I think, Casey, you have made the point that if you look at impact funds, whether they are debt funds or equity funds, right? What happens is there are two kinds of reporting, and that needs to be that's necessary. One is, of course, the financial reporting. Once you have given your loan or provided your investment capital, risk capital, it's to, use in some form of the business, which is going to give returns to the business, right? When you talk of impact funds providing debt or equity, they will not only expect that, but they also expect a lot of impact. The additionality here is impact. It could be climate impact, it could be inclusive impact, it could be economic empowerment, it could be anything. But there is a non-financial requirement of that business, and they are supposed to ensure that. There's a lot of criticism globally on the impact funds because the burden on the borrower or the investee is much more when they accept money from a impact investor, because not only are they expected to provide the same returns, except in very, very exceptional cases, blended finance and all other instruments, they have to give the 12 to 14% debt returns or 24% the fund returns. At the same time, a lot of impact reporting, impact work needs to be done. Otherwise, it's deemed to be a failed investment.
I'll give an example just to qualify this point further. So, for example, every fund will have a theory of change. Every fund will have an impact fund, will have a theory of change around what you want to address. If I talk about my current avatar, we, in addition to, as you said, financial returns, a business needs to be commercially solid and scalable. But in addition, we need to have a very strong CO2 reduction, CO2 emissions reduction, quantifiable number, right? Our goal is to build 100 by 100 businesses, which basically means businesses that can do 100 million revenue, but also in the process help reduce 100 MT of CO2 equivalent, right? In the process. So every fund will choose a North Star like that. And I think depending upon the constitution of the fund, their LPs, the adherence to having this dual nature of scrutiny on yourself and the businesses that you can fund and scale therein, that is what determines. So for our cases, we will reject cases unless or until we see both of these criteria being fulfilled, right? So, and it's different for different people, but that is typically how you should think about the duality of achieving an impact north metric along with financial returns.
So both of you, and I'll come to you, Gayathri. From both of you, for the last 10 years, you've been at you've almost started in Omnivore when agri investing was almost unheard of. Yeah. And then we've also come to a place where it's become extremely difficult for you to raise money in agri.
Yes.
So you've seen the entire landscape, and so have you from a Rabobank perspective. Tell me if the theory is meeting practice. So whatever we talked about here from an impact investing perspective and the fundamentals of having this, is it meeting in practice? Are we actually seeing density of organizations, density of evaluation on the non-financial part? Are we seeing that?
Look, Casey, I'll give you an example, specific. Let's talk about the microfinance sector. Till the late 90s, it was a grant-only sector. I mean, if you look at all the microfinance institutions, they were structured as trusts or societies, and they used to attract grants and use that grant to give loans to the poor. And then over a period of time, thanks to the effort of NABARD, SIDBI, DFID, etc., a business model around that was created, wherein you could have the same impact that the grants were achieving, but now you could scale up with commercial capital. That was one of the most successful scale-up of the development sector and the transformation of the development sector into a commercially viable sector, and the investors made tons of money there. And it also impacted a lot of people. Having said that, at that time, because the aim of microfinance in India and globally was that of providing debt to the poor and to enable them to do some business so that they are economically more empowered, they have more money in their hands, and they can spend on education, health, and other necessities. It was easy to capture all that information. There were multiple global and Indian organizations which worked on all that. But nowadays, the impact that we seek in terms of what he said, CO2, in terms of climate impact, it's getting very, very difficult because the need is huge to be able to make an impact. But are all the so-called climate funds really making an impact? The jury's out.
The point around agri, right, as you correctly said. So two things. One is theory to practice, translation losses. Yes, but with that, I think it's also important to understand that real money, and given the size and scale of the sector, real external equity capital only came into India 2018, 2019 onwards. Right, the first few businesses which got more than $5 million in equity basically were only after 2018, 2019, meaningfully. And we've seen a cycle of investment. I think where the jury is out is that these businesses, which are maybe 8, 10 years old now, and agri is a slower gestation industry, as we understand. So for these businesses to now go scale, return capital, will basically determine whether more and more capital allocation continues in the space or not at the same pace as we saw in 22, 23, right? So that is where, and there are a few good assets. There have of course been a few difficulties, like in any other young, fast-growing industry. There'll be some solid learnings as well. But I think the next 3 or 4 years will basically tell us, as exits come by, it will tell us whether the momentum and how that momentum looks like.
Thanks. So, I think I just realized a few minutes back that Gayathri is also a social entrepreneur who's basically gone through the omnivore cycle. But from your participation, your kind of view of largely non-profit organizations, but fundamentally also you've seen hybrid organizations that have a business side of their social enterprise that is fundamentally looking to sustain spaces. Now, they're coming to us for grants, they're going to other people for grants. What are some of these issues that you basically see, which we've been talking about, is that how do you report back on what you're doing? How do you basically access more grants? Is grants or philanthropic capital finally becoming catalytic enough for your commercial business and commercial market like funds to be opened up for you as an organization? What's your experience been in that space from, again, a portfolio perspective?
So I think from an impact lens, I think grant can be as kosher as it can get, because the expectation is predominantly only impact. So that gives us 3 major benefits, I would say. The first is that it kind of democratizes capability and innovation. So wherever there is capacity and innovation, that you will be in a position to kind of fund that. So it kind of democratizes that. But the good part is it also de-risks any of the equity that could come later. It creates a scaffolding, because be it any of the grants, then can have a public innovation in its forefront rather than only market innovation. Then you create a proper scaffolding that you de-risk further capital, right? Like it really forms the basis of social entrepreneurship, because it can kind of enable that. And also that you will be in a position to attract that risk. So if I were to think of grants, it's more a freedom capital and purpose-driven capital that can kind of go. But there are a flip side to this, is that it is available in smaller quantums, right? It's not available for a longer quantum. So it is very important hence to utilize smaller quantum, but then quickly experiment with this to see if we are able to build the scaffolding so that it becomes enabling it to either equity or the debt. And that smaller quantum is a challenge. And the second is that it can cross-subsidize. That is another big challenge, because it can, businesses should not be very philanthropic driven, because philanthropy is also very difficult. ROI on effort of the founder to get grants are also very difficult. So which does not allow for, if say 30-40% of quite a lot of social entrepreneurs here goes into just fundraising year after year, you're not going to be able to scale, because see, end of it, whether we like it or not, it's only 24 hours. into only one kind of a brain. So it is very difficult to kind of culminate. So the issue with grants, it's smaller, but the best part of it is that it can be very mission aligned. It can create pilots in such a way that we are de-risking future things, so that the next set of investments can be a lot more informed, because the grants are enabling that kind of a failure from the market perspective. So I think it becomes the first step, but the problem is that it is very, very limited than the other.
The inherent, I just wanted to basically ask this question because the inherent insight from your conversation is about timing and like match and fitment of the instrument that you're basically kind of choosing. Now, though in a conversation like this, we can basically kind of just linearly say, Acha, this is for early stage, this is for late stage. When you have a very capex thing, then you look for debt. But the reality is that we are now, over the last 3 or 4 years or last 1 year, we've seen organizations that were all good kind of completely disappear, right? And understanding the instrument to basically kind of choose there is very difficult. Now, early stage, we've seen grants and, grants largely work to kind of set you up in the social entrepreneurship space. But the minute you basically get over your first or second grant cycle or the third grant cycle, you're either left to fend for yourself, or debt becomes a possibility if equity is not becoming a possibility. Everybody does not have a disruptive technology-led proposition today. So a lot of these are fragmented problems you're solving. So you will have to basically do some smart work in still keeping funding pipelines active. And in that landscape, debt suddenly becomes almost a danger signal also. A lot of entrepreneurs feel that if I go early into debt, then chances are that I will not be able to basically kind of escape it. And they're constantly looking at equity to say, somebody comes in with money, be patient with me, look at the social capital that I'm also basically understand. So I also want to basically talk about the timing aspect. If you can talk about at what time of the social entrepreneur, what becomes more relevant. And the second one is basically more about understanding the fear of debt for many of the social entrepreneurs that we've had a conversation with. If Arindom, you want to...
Yeah, sure. What Gayathri mentioned right now is gold. That's ideally the journey from grant to equity or to grant to debt or to both. Now, one of the criticisms I have of the development sector in India, which has done tremendous work in agriculture, education, health, etc., in the last 30, 35 years that I've seen, is they are very good at technical assistance capacity building. But when it comes to building up businesses, that's what social entrepreneurs are supposed to do. That capacity is lacking. And because of the lack, during the designing of these programs, what makes a social entrepreneur bankable or investable is not in the design program. That's when a lot of grant money comes in, and then the social entrepreneur doesn't know whether he or she is bankable. They go to a financial institution and face rejection. That's because in the design phase itself, they were not taught. They were taught bits and parts of how to do the business, but how to attract capital and when to attract capital, and how do you go and negotiate with a financial institution or an investor. That's extremely critical, and it's at least in the agriculture projects programs, I've seen that during the design phase, they do not take the feedback of banks, the large Indian banks, to see what needs to be done so that they become attractive from a bank's perspective. And the program matures, they don't become bankable, and then there's a lot of frustration out there.
Just side question, does it come at the cost of social impact, building a business?
Well, it would. In a lot of instances, it would.
How does one address that, keeping the focus on the problem?
See, ultimately, if we are moving from grant to debt, or to equity investment, that means that you have a model which is a business model where you're generating surplus, where you're generating, to put it in simple terms, profits, positive cash flows, right? Now, if you continue to scale up in that business, we can assume that you're achieving the impact, the social impact that you were designed to do. Now, again, it's tricky because at times the entrepreneur or the social entrepreneur can change tracks, seeing that, look, I'll have to be perpetually be dependent on grant because I'm never going to become investable or bankable. But then, as I said, microfinance was an example of where it happened very well, though of course there were issues there. But we are seeing that in the agriculture sector with the farmer producer organization, very slow, but it's happening. A lot of them have turned profitable. They're attracting all kind of funding from different kind of pools of capital. They are achieving the impact that they were designed to do. But again, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one.
I think it's trickier for debt because I think you started this conversation by saying that the equity guys are okay to basically say some fail.
Correct.
But the debt guy is not basically looking
Not
to
at
see
all.
anything fail.
And from a compliance governance perspective, that's another issue. Even if they have some business model going, they have to be fully compliant with the laws of the land, and they have to be complete so far as paperwork and reporting to the authorities is concerned. Unfortunately, in most of the cases, at the first stage of due diligence of a financial institution, a business gets rejected. They don't even get into the financial analysis. The moment they look at the governance, they say, like, look, we can't do business with you.
Is there a perspective that you want to basically throw at the same context from an equity perspective as in what is becoming difficult of early stage organizations? Like, I think equity wants to go early. You want to find them early. You want to find them at the pathway where that exponential growth happens. But for an organization and a social entrepreneur who've kind of formed their businesses on the back of grants, let's say, or any other kind of funding initially, what's your kind of surprises that you kind of feel you come to and where it does not meet, like it basically kind of stops? Because I feel most of these enterprises are basically feeling the pinch in their 5 to 10 journey. Like the 0 to 5 and the 0 to 1 or whatever, the 0 to 1 journey is still fine. But the minute you start scaling, going beyond what you've promised, what is not clicking from an equity side perspective?
So I think, one of the things is that if, and that's a general bias many people in equity have, is that if an enterprise has only been working through grants for a very, very, very long time, for 6, 7, 8 years, 9 years, then for them to suddenly flip a switch and say that now I am becoming a lot more, like there's a real business, there's real surplus, and hence that surplus can access debt, because if you don't have basic cash flows, debt can't support you. Similarly, if let's say you get an equity investor early, but at some point there will be a financial return. A financial return is unfortunately or fortunately linked to scale. Scale is again linked to, can you generate surplus, can you generate scale enough that it becomes interesting for someone else to purchase or to raise more money. There are only two ways an equity investor will get an exit. Either the asset gets sold or your stake as an investor gets sold to somebody else who can then carry forward the journey. So I think in that lens, and again, it's not that examples are not there. I'll give a practical example from my past fund where we invested in a business, Dehat, right? Dehat, for the first 4 years of its existence, was basically running on grants and bootstrap till they were able to refine the model. For 4 years, right? It started as a not-for-profit, moved into a for-profit for about 4.5 years, 2012 to 16, yeah. So they were basically running on their own savings and some grants. And then after 2017, there was a business model. They started to generate surplus, keeping the farmer at the center of their operations to whatever extent was possible at that point in time. And that is what then allowed us to underwrite or come in. And then, of course, later on, it's scaled. But I think like there are very few examples, to be very fair. There are not, out of 10, there might be 2 or 3 examples where this classic journey continues. Otherwise, there is generally some break where either an equity guy or a debt provider is unable to build or bridge that gap with social entrepreneur.
I think quickly before we get into the Q&A and all of that stuff, I think 2 questions I wanted to ask everybody. Where has your instrument failed an entrepreneur? It's just, it was not the right time, it was not the right organization, we kind of pitched, we kind of believed in something that we saw was rewarding, but it did not turn out, or the instrument was just completely wrong for them.
So I think there are 2 aspects to when it comes to basically an instrument that we are talking about. So what happens is that you start getting dependent on that. So sometimes you take a longer time, because whenever there is grants that is kind of available, then the urge to kind of give the returns kind of slows down. I think that becomes a challenge, because then you start going, sometimes what does happen is that you will have to work with a good enough that you can scale. Because if you can start going very, very deep, then it kind of becomes difficult. So where do you identify the good enough? Because once they start to get into the space where I will go deep and deep and deep, so then probably you kind of have a scale issue. So I think then you are dependent on grants for a longer period of time. That's another problem, because you're not bringing the commercial lens, because you become very tied down to saying, you know what, this is the right way to do. I think in a way, philosophy does come in the way of things, saying, I have to do it perfectly right for this one person kind of thing, than good enough for a long. Because I think it's very important for an entrepreneur to kind of take that earlier, to say, this is the time frame from which, hey, probably they give me a step. I mean, it is like a pole vault, right? Like you go and then you use that and then you jump, but then you can't use that thing and try to climb, you will not climb. Like it cannot be done slower. So it's very important for an entrepreneur to start thinking it that way, from a very commercial angle, to say, hey, this is the place where I will come inside, this place that I will go into the next stage. Because some spaces become comfortable, then you start experimenting and try to go deep, then it becomes like a burying part of it, that I think becomes a challenge from
So maybe in our
the
interest,
grants
we see the human story from a grant perspective, and we don't see the business story at all, and then fuel.
No, I wouldn't
it.
say the business story. You would see, like,
Or
say,
the
for example, I can be
replicability or
like,
scalability of
very
that particular.
mother relatable, is that I can be only mother to 2. 2 is too much, let me say. I cannot be a mother to 100, right? Then you send to a teacher, right? There the teacher is not expected to take care of social, intelligence, emotional, blah, 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 and slap anything, right? Like, so then that is how you have to also view business, that you cannot go, some parts of it you will have to move and then go into wide coverage. That becomes very important.
Specifically with grants.
Yeah, so.
Let me give a different perspective from a debt provider's view. Now, when I do a corporate loan, for a large corporate, there's a requirement of 200 crores, $200 million. I get the best of talent to structure a facility, which is complicated, but I solve that problem because I make money. I can invest in my transaction cost to make that happen. But when it comes to retail loans, and that's what your social entrepreneurs want, they want small dose of capital at the right time and the right kind of products. That's where banks don't have the ability to innovate, because these days banks use a lot of tech-based delivery system for their loan underwriting. They'll say, okay, answer these 10 questions. If it's yes, we move to stage 2. And if you move this, here's your loan. But if a social entrepreneur who's not doing traditional business but trying to solve a problem which requires a very specialized product of, say, 5 lakh rupees, no bank is willing to invest time and effort to build up that 5 lakh facility. They have the ability, but it's just too expensive for them.
From
from an equity perspective, instrument has been wrong or understood?
I mean, all the time. So
You've already accounted
we
for
have a, we were kind of accounted for it. We account for a 50, 60, 80% failure rate, right? So, but I think on a serious note, I think it's when either there is, we've had examples where too much capital going in has put an undue pressure on the business to grow too fast. Now that has enabled some business to scale really well. So it truly depends, like it's the entrepreneur essentially again and their discipline as to understand whether their sector can really grow at that speed or not. It's possible in a lot of other consumer tech businesses, but can agri scale at 10x year on year? The answer is no, right? So things will fall flat, right? So I think that is one thing, that excess capital too soon. We have seen cases where it was the wrong match.
it just gets stuck.
Yeah.
So very quickly, I think out of time, but 30 seconds. What is one thing that you would change in the next 5 years for the social entrepreneurship and funding structurally in India? Do you want to basically, like, it could be on the instrument side, it could be on the social entrepreneurship side?
Let me have a go at that. I would say what we call blended finance, where the grant maker comes in or takes the risk, as you mentioned. What happens is not only there's a mingling of grant and loans, but even knowledge of the grant maker has is mingled with the knowledge that a debt provider has, because the debt provider doesn't have the knowledge of a grant maker in terms of deep impact, in terms of understanding the difference it's going to make to society, and vis-a-vis a grant maker has very little idea about commercial success of a business. And so if they work together, the blended effort with the blended capital is what is going to make a difference, and it's not easy.
Got it. Very interesting.
I was actually about to say the same thing. I think more blended finance, and even I think there are now structures where equity is also coming into blended form, where there is a first loss kind of structure coming in.
Right.
I guess what's Abhishek's fund called? GAVA, right? So GAVA did that and is kind of doing it well. So I would think that will see more, and I think a little more on outcome specific funds, which is a natural thing. I think India has a lot of very focused funds, and more will come.
Yeah.
So sector
Result-based,
specialists will come.
outcome-based is
Result
something that
based.
we have to do.
I think the biggest challenge also lies in creating this nice chain and a loop
The order.
inside the order plus the loop where the collaboration. Because somewhere I do feel that the grants kind of get a little isolated in that sense, because it starts to take this whole avatar of deep work, more non-profit. The orientation is slightly different, because I think markets can solve a lot of problems. So it is very important to create the chain and the loops of chain where each of us can kind of blend together. That I don't think there is a little more between debt and equity, a lot more than from the grants. I think some of the government grants or the private grants, if there is a catalyst and then you kind of catapult the organization, then they take over, and then there is a dire necessity for some experimentation where grant comes in. I don't think we've created this a chain where the goal is a social entrepreneurship, right? Like a goal is an impactful organization. I don't think we have, in that sense, interacted well, and we have not collaborated well. So grants has seen more charity, and then I think a little more collaboration happens between the debt and thing. But then, like in this stage, I feel a little gendered out in that sense. So I think philanthropic funds kind of, the grants kind of gets out instead of being into the system, because if I'm also an organization dependent more on grants, I'm sure Subhadeep and Arindom will raise the eyebrows saying, this organization has been on grants for a longer period of time. Do I even want to take them? That conversation has to happen, and we have to create this loop. And that loop is a tougher thing right now, I feel.
So there is a chance of entrepreneurship in the orchestration side.
Yes, and the collaboration, I think where we lose is that as soon as you think a grant-dependent organization, somewhere in the head, Subhadeep will say, they've been all grant-dependent, should I give equity? And then Arindam will say, they've been grant-dependent, will they repay my debt? So that becomes a challenge, because the instruments not talk to each other, because it can create such a beautiful pole vault jump in impact in social entrepreneurship, which
Great points. Thank you so much. I'm going to take a couple of questions before we move on to the next section of the session. There's a related question from somebody here saying that thoughts on using grants as guarantees for risk sharing to kind of unlock affordable debt. Thoughts on that?
It's happening. It's already happening in the Indian market. I've been involved in a lot of these transactions where we get money from global foundations and other philanthropic organizations, and they take the first loss. Now, having said that, what it has enabled is that Indian financial institution to provide debt to a certain segment of people or certain businesses which was underserved earlier because of the uncertainty of the kind of business, especially climate, resilient or climate smart businesses, because it had never been done before. But what it doesn't achieve is lowering the cost of debt, because even if you mingle grant with commercial debt, it can help you to de-risk yourself, but your cost of money for a NBFC or a bank remains the same. They are not going to bring down the, it's widely, I mean, that's one of the misconception in the Indian market. Correct. Is the moment you have blended finance, the cost will go down from 12% to 6%. It doesn't happen. It will enable a financial institution to take higher risk and to lend to a segment which otherwise they would not.
Correct. There's, no panel is, or no conversation is full or complete till somebody asks, how can we replicate the Amul model? So, kind of the same question. Amul has shown that business and social impact can go hand in hand. So, why Amul-like organizations can't be replicated? Or everybody takes those same examples. So, what are your thoughts? What are your answers about why that's not happening enough?
So I'm just taking the first thing is that it's also the time frame in which certain things happened. When you had excess milk and that it could be reconstituted, certain models kind of came in. Yeah. But we are currently in a very fast market models and very different consumer models. So I think, for me is that our expectation should not be also that saying, hey, can there be PSUs like, right? So things we know that certain things work at certain points of time, and now it is about making every money work. So I think the models will evolve. Instead of saying, hey, can we replicate certain models? Certain models are beautiful at a certain point of time, but at a certain point of time, I think we have to evolve.
Let me add another thing. So let's see the nature of the commodity. It is not only in India, it's happened globally in the dairy sector. Dairy is highly perishable, milk. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the milk producers and the milk aggregators, the chilling plant, and you pour milk once or twice. And it's ideal for cooperative or cooperative-like institutions in the dairy sector. Not only in India, you look at Netherlands, you look at New Zealand, you look anywhere in the world. Cooperatives play about a major part in the dairy supply chain globally because it works beautifully. When it comes to other commodities, food commodities, it's once a year you interact with the market, or in 6 months you interact with that market. So that intensity of interaction and that symbiotic relationship between the market and the producer is not there. That's why for dairy, the scale up with impact, social impact, happens very quickly. It's not only for India, globally it has happened.
I'll remember that. I'll basically quote that next time somebody asks this question. The last question, which is quite relevant, I think, how do you impact-focused investors assess the growth and valuation prospects of SaaS platforms that are serving NGOs and CBOs, especially when financial returns and social impact are intertwined? So effectively, how do you assess these kind of businesses that are kind of catering to non-profits? There are multiples. As in Proteon, I think I just read that there was a CSR suite of services. So what is your expectation from an equity perspective or funding perspective for organizations where the transaction is longer, return is slower?
But if it's a SaaS business, I would view it as a SaaS business. The
Correct.
customer at the other end of the SaaS business may not be an extremely sophisticated entity, right? Is that the question, right? So, or it's a slow to
some
grow.
ways, yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, you would still map the TAM or the potential market size of this product,
It-
right? The same
Same
way
standards.
you would, same standards will apply. I don't think there will be, I mean, at least I don't think there'll be a special discount they would apply today because it is servicing a certain kind of, to the point that we earlier made. I think return expectations from LPs, even for impact funds, are not terribly muted. They do expect market returns. What you might get a leeway is there'll be more holding period associated. You might have a 12-year fund instead of an 8-year fund, which basically means you have longer to run. But if the market, the end market is not big enough, or if the need for this product is limited and hence will need too many people for a business to become a $10 million, $20 million SaaS business, the same underwriting principles will be there.
I think it's a very interesting point, and it's a good thing to kind of take away from our conversation today is that, just from an impact investing perspective or debt funds or any of these instruments that we're talking about, the cost of capital does not necessarily change. But the ability to take risks is what impact investing or impact debt capital or grants are basically kind of bringing in, that I am willing to take the risk. Don't ask me to basically take the risk and also reduce the cost of capital, because that will be two things to kind of do. So I think that's a interesting point. I don't know if it's a good insight and everybody like it, but it's still it's a truth that we want to basically talk about. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and being candid and straightforward with us. Thank you so much.